everything, but turn it on. Sister-in-law does that. She fills the basket up.
Oh my!
Wow. Show, O Lord, your ways to me, and teach me your paths. Direct me in your truth and teach me, for you are God, my Savior. Lord, help us to know you and to know ourselves better, to do your will and not ours, that we might come to you more fully throughout our lives and upon death. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, so, hello everybody, how's it going?
All good.
All right.
Good morning.
So we're sort of nearing the end of our looking at the political history of the church. Today, last week we did sort of external politics issues the church was dealing with between Vatican I and Vatican II. Today we're going to be dealing with internal church issues between Vatican I and Vatican II. So roughly, what are sort of the internal debates within the church, within the Vatican, amongst bishops, sort of between 1870 and 1962. And then we'll try to finish up political history of the church before we break for Christmas. So that'll be, I guess, a combination of, I guess, next Sunday, how many more weeks do we have before Christmas? How many more Sundays do we have? 2 more? Okay, so it looks like we'll probably have... Okay, so next week we'll try to finish it up next week. Okay. All right, so we'll try to finish up political history next week. Now, for those who frequented the apologetics class last year, we ended up doing something like 3 weeks on doing apologetics for Vatican II, and one of the classes was things leading up to Vatican II. So if you were here for that class, this will be kind of similar, but not exactly the same. So the two...
I love that.
What?
It's just the way you said it.
Okay, well, let's see. So there are the 2 handouts I have today. One is a document from 1907, released by Pope Pius X, called "On the Doctrine of the Modernists," Pascendi Dominici Egregius. And then the other one here is an encyclical on religious unity and ecumenism by Pope Pius XI, 1928, called "Mortalium Animus." So, so everyone gets, one of each of those. Yes. So, all right. So both of those deal with point number 4 over here on the issue of modernism and ecumenism, which are both going to be issues that are going to come up at the Second Vatican Council. Okay. So, internal issues between Vatican I and Vatican II. So, who can remind me what exactly happens that makes Vatican I end? Why does Vatican I end abruptly?
I would have never guessed that.
Who remembers?
Franco-Prussian War.
What? Which war?
Franco-Prussian
War. Thank you very much. Why would the Franco-Prussian War make Vatican Council I down in Rome end abruptly? Why would the Franco-Prussian War make an ecumenical council taking place in Rome end abruptly?
They had to pull the French troops out.
It's separate.
They had to pull the French troops out of Rome?
Of Rome.
Ah, why were French troops in Rome?
They were trying to get it back.
Protecting the Pope of the Vatican.
France.
Yeah.
Wasn't as powerful anymore? Something about the Italian government was somewhat powerful.
Yeah, so Italian unification movement is happening. In 1848, what happened in the Papal States? What? Revolution, very good. So there was an attempted revolution led by Giuseppe Mazzini in 1848 that kicks the Pope out of Rome. The Pope is restored to the Papal States, however, by the French army.
That's what Pop could.
don't think we passed.
The French army then maintains a garrison in the Papal States to ensure that there would not be another Italian unification-sponsored revolution in the Papal States. But during the Franco-Prussian War, the Prussians beat the French, and as a condition on the peace treaty, the French have to withdraw all of their troop bases in Italy that were protecting the Pope. So, the Franco-Prussian War happened during Vatican I. So, while Vatican I is happening, the French are withdrawing their troops, and when the last French troops leave, the bishops have to get the heck out of Dodge, because they're afraid that the Italian revolutionaries are going to come back in and impose their will on the Papal States and get rid of, church authority. And to a wide extent they do. But in 1870, as I said before, the Pope, last class, the Pope is confined to the Vatican by the new Italian government. He's allowed to send messages out, he's allowed to have messengers come in and out, people are allowed to go see him, but the person of the Pope is not allowed to leave the Vatican. And this finally gets resolved with the Lateran Accords in 1929, which was which was a treaty signed by Mussolini's newly installed government, more or less newly installed, and the Vatican, in which the Italian government promises to pay the Vatican a debt, or yes, a certain subsidy in perpetuity in compensation for the conquest of the Papal States. The Pope was allowed to communicate freely with the world, and that the Vatican city-state would not criticize Italian foreign policy decisions. So essentially, the Vatican city-state agrees to lay off Italian politics, and in exchange, the Italians will ensure the safety of the Pope and church property and things like this. All right, that's the Lateran Accords in 29, and to this day, the Italian government still pays that subsidy to the Vatican city-state as an indemnity for conquering the Papal States. Okay, so there are 6 major issues that the church is dealing with internally between, say, 1870 and 1962. A lot of these, some of these, like number 1 and number 2, number 1 and number 2 had kind of been holdover issues ever since the 1600s. So these are 2 things that were a big deal, starting with, say, the Counter-Reformation, but had continued being a deal into the 1800s and early 1900s. 3 through 6 are all issues that sort of come up in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the church is kind of addressing anew. So, issue number 1. There's sort of this internal dispute within the church, and sort of an administrative dispute here, over what exactly the administrative relationship is between the Pope and local bishops. Right? So, how can I put it? No one had disputed that the Pope's theological standing, the Pope's ability to resolve theological disputes. No one really disputed the Pope's ability to be the sort of final arbiter of theological decisions within the church. Right? No one doubted Petrine primacy within the church at this time. However, prior to the Council of Trent, the Pope had exercised his papal infallibility more as a judicial officer. Right? He would wait for issues to come to him. So this had some spillover into administrative decisions. Most administrative decisions, the Pope would sort of leave to, like for appointment for bishops, for example, the Pope would say that he would have a right to confirm local bishops, but there were times when the Pope would go out and say, like, I'm appointing this bishop right here, but it was considered much more, the onus was on the local diocese to do the bishop appointment. It's just that the Pope sort of had to confirm and confer legitimacy on the local bishop. Now, the Council of Trent sort of says it's that kind of situation that led to the problems of the Protestant Reformation. So the Council of Trent sort of establishes a system where the Pope actually needs to select the local bishop. Right? And so it sort of places a lot more administrative centralization for local dioceses in Rome. Now what Vatican I does is Vatican I in 1860, 1970, they like double down on this. Vatican I essentially says that the job of administratively, the local bishop is to be appointed by the Bishop of Rome, and the local bishop is essentially supposed to execute the game plan the Pope is calling. Right, so local bishops are not to sort of make independent judgments of the Vatican. Right? So the way I can describe this is that maybe like prior to the Council of Trent, the Pope, everyone acknowledges the Pope as the coach of the team, right? But sort of the offensive, the defensive coordinators, they sort of have free reign to do what they're doing unless it contradicts the head coach's game plan. At which point, then the head coach will wade into it and say, defensive coordinator, that goes against the overarching strategy I pointed out. Right, you're done, I'm hiring somebody new. Right? After the Council of Trent, this goes to the head coach, sits down with the offensive and the defensive coordinator and all the other coaches, and says, okay, this is basically what I want you guys to do, but you sort of have some free reign within the confines of the specific boundaries I've put you guys in, you local bishops. Vatican I comes along and says, we're not so sure that's working, so what we're going to do is, the head coach is going to take over the team, and the head coach is going to let the offensive and the defensive coordinator and all the coaches know exactly what's up. Right? The Pope is like giving them the game plans and saying, these are the game plans that I have come up with, you guys memorize the game plans and execute. Alright, so that's essentially what Vatican I is doing. Vatican I makes the Pope the universal ordinary, meaning that the Pope is essentially the head bishop of every diocese everywhere, and the local bishop's job is to execute the game plans of the Pope. Yes?
Yeah, would the recent changes in the Mass be an example of this carrying on still now? Or?
What, the recent changes?
Yeah, you know, where the U.S. had to come in accord with the rest of
I wouldn't necessarily say that, because what Vatican II is going to do is Vatican II is going to change the administrative relationship, and then this is like, what the bishops are doing now is kind of like, let's try to salvage some of the unintended consequences of Vatican II. Right? So, there's this big issue then between Vatican I and Vatican II, that the local bishops, so on the one hand, local bishops really kind of want more autonomy. They want more free reign to make decisions on the local level, right? Local bishops really don't want to just be turning around and saying, yes, sir, Mr. Pope, I'll get the job done. I'll report back to you on my progress. Local bishops want a little bit more autonomy. That being said, from the papal perspective here, whenever in the previous 400 years, whenever they had granted local bishops more autonomy, you ended up getting Protestantism and, you know, kings influencing the local bishops, and you end up with schisms. You end up with local bishops, bowing to local political authorities and things like this. You end up with local bishops teaching things that are more inclined toward the Enlightenment philosophers and sometimes dancing on the line of orthodoxy. So, for the papal perspective, Vatican I is saying, no, we need strict lines as to what local bishops are allowed to do. The Pope is going to lay those out. Right, so there's this sort of tension here. How much of a top-down administrator should the Pope be, and how much should the Pope allow local bishops to exercise free, independent judgment? Right. Priests. Okay, so prior to the Council of Trent, priests had always been trained by an apprentice system. Right, you wanted to be a priest, we apprentice you just like if you were in a guild or a trade union to a master priest. The master priest trains you, and then when he thinks that you're ready to go, the diocese will then ordain you a priest. All right. Council of Trent says, no, that's one of the big problems we're having right now that's sparking the Reformation. Right? Black Death is killing off a lot of our highly trained priests. So those priests who would normally do the apprenticing are now doing a lot more, they have like many apprentices at one time. It's harder for them to devote more attention. Also, if you have a bad priest who's doing apprenticeship, for many priests, you're going to get lots of poorly trained priests. So the Council of Trent says, we're going to establish a seminary system. We're going to sort of standardize the education of priests across the board. All right. So as a result of this, priests now have a standardized education. One of the negative byproducts of this, one of the potential negative byproducts, is that this had the side effect of creating a lot more separation between the average layperson and the average priest. Because, prior to the Council of Trent, you went through this apprentice system. Well, your apprentice priest, it's got, how can I put it? Think of it as the difference between, like, let's say you have a boss who, like, say you have a boss, but your boss, like, worked his way up through the ranks, like the apprentice system. But with the seminary system, this means that, like, your boss didn't necessarily work up his way through the ranks. He, like, went straight from nothing to, like, to manager, because he had the right degrees, the right things on his resume.
It's a college hire.
Officer in the Navy, when you go into Annapolis, you're automatically up here as an officer.
Okay.
You never came up through the ranks like a war officer.
Okay, perhaps, yeah. So this is sort of the difference here, that prior to the Council of Trent, all priests have to sort of make it through this apprentice system to become priests. Council of Trent basically says, well, we can't trust the apprentice system to turn out good priests anymore, so what we have to do is we have to create the standardized thing, which means that you have lots of priests now that are sort of going into one level of education. They're essentially all priests now are going to a college level education. They all have to have this college level education, and they're not necessarily working their way up through the ranks, like, doing things with common people, things like that. Yes.
Did that set up resentment between the brother priests?
Well, in some ways, in some places, in some ways, yeah. So one of the issues here is that, so there are two subcategories. So first of all, here with the priests, there's the training issue, right? So now priests in general, when they get educated on the seminary system in the Council of Trent, there's a lot more. The people who become priests don't have like the same kind of experiences with the common man that they might have had otherwise, because you're getting this high level of education, but most people don't have this high level of education. Now the second thing that you're getting at here, Bob, is not only is the training creating a separation, but without the apprentice system, it's not like seminary education was free, right? So in order to get into seminary system, you either had to already have family money, or you had to have, if you weren't wealthy, you had to have a rich patron who would be willing to put you through the seminary system, right? So it's not like seminary wasn't free, right? Yes?
And about what year was that?
This would have been the Council of Trent establishes the first sort of universal seminary system for the training of priests.
And what year was that?
Council of Trent would have ended in the 1560s. So you're talking, it starts in 1545,
Okay, so it
it
was
ends in 1560.
200 years before VatII.
Yes, yeah, okay. So then what ends up happening is that priests here, so priests often are also, during this period of time, are a little bit more, I don't want to say they didn't accept anyone who wasn't independently wealthy, but it's kind of like, if you were from a wealthy family, it was much easier to become a priest. You were sacrificing a lot less to become a priest than if you were from like a family that was not independently wealthy, right? So there's also sort of, especially in Europe, there's a sort of elitism that develops amongst the priesthood as a result of this system. And let's see what else. So there's the training side of things. There's the elitism. Oh, also as part of the seminary training. Actually, hold on. Let me hold on to that. So Council of Trent does all this stuff. When Vatican I comes along, one of the effects of Vatican I says, okay, we need to address this. But they don't have a whole lot of time to address the detailed issues of seminary because there's an imminent revolution. So one of the effects of Vatican I is they kind of preserve the existing system as it had come to be. So one of the things that Vatican I on the type of seminary training was that Vatican I emphasized very much that it was actually undesirable for priests to get to be very close to their flock and their parish. You wanted to maintain a very professional separation between the priests and the people. Vatican I very much thought that that you wanted the priest, in order for the priest to be a spiritual father to the people, he couldn't also really be your friend. That makes sense,
So
right?
it had to be a disciplinarian.
Yeah, like a priest at your parish, in the Vatican I understanding of things, his job is to guide you spiritually and sort of not to be touchy-feely, not to be your friend, not to know you on a personal level. As a matter of fact, the priest is probably better at doing his job if he's not a personal friend of yours, right? So the seminary system after Vatican I teaches priests that are going into the seminary system to maintain a discrete professional distance from the people that he's flocking, that he's shepherding.
That must have been very hard on the priests themselves.
Well, you also have to remember that there were more priests at the time. So like a church like St. John's, probably had, 2 or 3 priests living in the rectory. They had community amongst themselves, right? So this was one of the effects of Vatican I, that the sort of issues in the system that had started with the Council of Trent and sort of increased was now sort of compounded by this practical teaching that priests should not, there should be a discrete distance here. And one of the reasons for this was, with all this other stuff going on, if all this other stuff is going on that we're going to be talking about here, and it's sort of like having an effect on the lay people, in order for the priest to effectively teach the church what the church teaches, he's going to have to not sort of engage in these other kind of things that the laity are picking up from non-Catholic sources. All right, so you don't want the priesthood to get, you want the priest to be infected by anything the laity might be catching, might be picking up. Right, so it's kind of think of it as like this. There's lots of non-Catholic ideas that could endanger people's souls. You wouldn't want the doctor to catch the disease in an epidemic, would you? No. So you want to make sure that the doctors have like a hazmat suit essentially, and they have these, professional regulations that will make it less likely for them to catch whatever disease is spreading during the epidemic. So from the Vatican's perspective, everything since the Protestant Reformation was basically like the spreading of an intellectual epidemic that was destroying the souls of lots of people, right? So you want to make sure that the priests are firewalled against this. You want to make sure the priests are not also getting in the trenches and teaching heresy and teaching lax things, right? So this is sort of one of the big issues. So you've got the local bishop, you've got the Vatican versus local bishop issue, but then you've got the priest training issue, right? And you don't exactly want to go back to an apprentice system. You want to keep the seminary system, but seminary, a standardized system of doing things is, expensive for the church to maintain. Plus you have to train the priest a certain way. So it's kind of an issue here. Any questions on number 1? So this is a big issue between Vatican I and Vatican II. Vatican II is going to try to address the bishop and priest relationship. Yes, Francis.
I've got a question on it. I can go back a long time ago when I was in 5th grade or whatever in the Catholic school back in the 30s. And it was unheard of to go to another church for anything. I wonder if that had something to do with that the Catholic didn't want you to get informed another one to take you away from their church or something like that?
Yeah. So this is actually why Pope Pius XI issues this document here, Mortali Monimus, about why ecumenism is bad. So this basically says that Catholics are not to engage in any kind of religious activities that would involve exposure to other religions. The idea was that Pope Pius XI here is sort of saying, look, the average Catholic, not very educated on the ways of philosophy and theology. It is very easy for them to be led astray by slick-talking Protestants. Consequently, it might be okay for Catholics to, work with Protestants in the workplace. It might be okay for Catholics to work with Protestants, if they're, going to stores or something like that. But you do not want Catholics to be in any kind of situation where they might be, where they might be swayed by these slick-talking Protestants that know their Bible stuff that, the average Catholic is not able to respond to. Right? So it was sort of that idea. It's like we don't know if our flock is going to be very able to discern the difference between something that sounds good but is a heresy and something that, is not heresy. So we're going to solve the problem by just saying, until further notice, you are not to engage in any kind of religious discussions with people who are not Catholics. Yes?
Did it cover marriage with other religions? Persons, Catholics marrying persons outside?
Well, I'm not sure if the document itself addresses this, but I do know that the policy was that
No.
to discourage this, but you could marry a non-Catholic, but only if the non-Catholic was married in a Catholic church with you, and they promised that when you had children, that the children essentially would not know that you were a non-Catholic.
They had to be married outside the altar rail.
They had to be married outside the altar rail, so you couldn't get the same. Yeah. Okay. So that was essentially the policy, and that policy is actually still in place today. But that's essentially where Pope Pius XI is going here, right? We don't want those slick-talking Protestants to, beguile those, to ensorcel those, poor uneducated Catholics, right? We care so much about our people that we don't want their souls to be in danger just because those slick-talking Protestants that can quote Bible stuff, might confuse them. So you have to talk to Protestants about religious things. So, another issue here is Enlightenment philosophers. So, once again, we're talking, I can split quotations around this. The Enlightenment philosophers are called Enlightenment philosophers because they call themselves Enlightenment philosophers, and the name stuck. So, for this, we're talking people like, your John Locke, your Thomas Hobbes, your Jean-Jacques Rousseau, your, I guess René Descartes would probably fit in here.
Quite a few Frenchmen.
Yeah, the French revolutionary guys. Perhaps your Scottish, if you want to throw in your Scottish Enlightenment there, you can. So there was a running debate in the church ever since, Kant and Descartes as to how much of this Enlightenment philosophy was compatible with Catholicism and how much of it was not compatible with Catholicism. So there were sort of running debates amongst bishops and amongst Catholic theologians, like, no, this could be compatible with the faith, but no, this certainly is not. So, so one of the big issues here was, let's see, so Pope Pius IX, who was Pope when Vatican I was happening, tried to solve this problem by releasing what was called the Syllabus of Errors. So if you were here for the apologetics class, last year we did a class on the Syllabus of Errors. He issued a document, a Syllabus of Errors, which had 84 specific things that were taught by Enlightenment philosophers that he said fundamentally contradicted the teachings of the apostles. So he said, this is a list of 84 things that are said by Enlightenment philosophers that you cannot believe if you are a Catholic. Right? So there was sort of a running debate here as to what could be acceptable and what could not be acceptable. So and I would say essentially what happened is that anything that looked like it might support the French Revolution was condemned. So like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, basically condemned. Anything by Voltaire, condemned. Diderot, condemned. Right? That being said, things that were less likely to be condemned came out, the British and the Scottish Enlightenment had fewer things condemned than the Continental Enlightenment did. So, for example, you know, let's see, like John Locke, the church kind of said, well, you know, we don't agree with Locke on lots of things as a matter of practice, but you know what? You know, we can kind of live with John Locke. Like, we give him a cautious okay. Let's see, you know, Thomas Hobbes, don't really like him too much, but like, cautious okay. Scottish Enlightenment guys, you know, like, you know, David Hume, you know, some of the things he says we condemn, but some of the things we didn't condemn that David Hume said. You know, Adam Smith, again, some of the things he said we did not condemn, other things he said we did condemn. Stuff like that. So there was this running debate as to what exactly was compatible with the with Catholicism and what was not. Again, the Continental Enlightenment got more things condemned than, say, the British and Scottish Enlightenment did. But the sort of exhaustive list is the 1854 Syllabus of Errors by Pope Pius IX. Okay. So, social doctrine. It's during this period of time that social doctrine actually becomes a sub-discipline of Catholic theology. So, Pope Leo XIII issues Rerum Novarum in 1891. This is what we call the first social encyclical, first explicitly social encyclical. So, of course, prior to this, you know, like Christians had always said that, you know, social justice was important. It was important to make the world a better place. It was important to help the poor, things like this. But Pope Leo XIII says that the church has a moral responsibility to define truths about the nature of society. So if there was something that would undermine society necessarily, the church had a right to condemn that particular social practice. Or the church would have a right to preserve things that would enhance society. So, for example, you know, we start to get lots of after Pope Leo, after Rerum Novarum, we start to get, you know, the church issuing a lot of, you know, encyclicals about the importance of the family for society, the importance of preserving the family, not just for theological reasons, but because it benefits society, right? You get, the big thing that happens in Rerum Novarum here is Leo XIII talks about sort of capitalism versus socialism. Now, what's interesting here is that this document is actually, it's often misunderstood in the popular imagination, because what he does here is Leo XIII condemns Marxism outright. He says that, like, Marxist socialist thought is to be condemned. If you are a communist, you are excommunicated, automatically. But he does also condemns capitalism, but the aspects of capitalism he condemns are like, he condemns aspects of capitalism that are like byproducts of capitalism. So, for example, he says that one of the things that's bad about capitalism is that it makes people more materialistic. Right? It creates a consumer culture, and the consumer culture is bad. You know, he says that, you know, what else? You know, he says that it is wrong for employers to exploit their employees by making them work hours that are too excessive for pay that is too little.
He sounds like a communist. I mean, the communists were saying those things.
Not practicing it, but saying.
They were saying those things. That's confusing.
I don't think so. So for example, Rerum Novarum, one of the big differences here is that Pope Leo XIII says there is a natural right to have private property. The communists weren't saying that.
That's true.
Right. You know, Pope Leo XIII also says that overtaxation is unjust in this document. That being said, he then also says that, you know, it's up to your society to determine what constitutes overtaxation. right? So like communists weren't saying that either. You know, that being said, you know, he one of the things he does say is that like you shouldn't think that, you know, capitalism can solve all problems, because, you know, capitalism, he says, you know, two of the major drawbacks to capitalism is that it assumes that you have full knowledge of all of your options, which you may not, because human beings have imperfect knowledge, and it assumes also perfect mobility. In other words, if all of the jobs are in a certain place because the free market has said that, then you'd be willing to move to that place just because it's where the jobs are, right? So he says those are a couple of just assumptions that capitalism makes that are not true in reality, and as a result, society has a responsibility to try to overcome those particular drawbacks, right? So the thing that he's condemning, things that he condemns in capitalism are sort of these things that are ancillary to capitalism, things that could be effects of capitalism that he says society has a responsibility to try to overcome. Whereas like he condemns, he says, Marxists say that you can't have private property, condemned. You know, Marxists say that everyone should have like materially equal stuff, condemned. Marxists say that the purpose, that society is, that man's fundamental worth is his economic worth, condemned. Right? So that kind of stuff.
It's a hard place to be, because there's no perfect system.
Not on God's green earth.
Not on
Perhaps in
God's
heaven. Okay. All right. So social doctrine sort of starts up, and it starts up as a result of Leo XIII's encyclical here, I guess, as a sub-discipline of theology. It starts up as a result of Leo XIII's encyclical here, and it's created sort of a series of disputes ever since, because you can see sort of at least in like United States, for example, because you can see on the one hand he's saying that you know, workers need to have strong protections against exploitation. On the other hand, he's saying that like overtaxation is unjust, right? On the other hand, he's saying that there is an inherent right to private property that cannot be infringed. Right. Yes, Bob.
Last fall, do you know Father Robert Sirico?
Yeah, Sirico, yeah.
Okay, he turned out a new book talking about
the morality of capitalism,
right?
Yeah, morality of markets. Yeah. Yeah, so within like Catholic, you can see this even today. There are some Catholic organizations that that like focus on and try to point out the parts of Rerum Novarum, say, where Leo XIII says the free market does good things. But then there are also Catholic organizations that have organizations that like try to point out all the parts of Rerum Novarum where Leo XIII says that capitalism does bad things, right? So it's sort of an unresolved dispute here. Now, there's also a strand of Catholic social thought called distributism, which goes back to Chesterton, and Chesterton is sort of like, he's sort of advocating like an anti-economics way of thinking about things, that like Catholics should go back to the land and like work farms and things like this. Right, and that like that's the best way to beat the consumer culture that Leo XIII is talking about here, is to go back, and Catholics should return to the land and have farms and kind of, you know, live similar to Amish people, but, you know, not exactly like Amish people. So there's sort of these three strands here of Catholic social thought that are a result of this. On the one hand, you have what many people call like Austrian school economics, which is much more of a sort of F.A. Hayek, you know, free market kind of a thing, like markets, like the free market is a very moral enterprise that helps reduce poverty and things like this. You then have like the distributists, which are, you know, like G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, that are sort of advocating an anti-economics approach, you know, going back to the land, you know, not engaging in consumer culture, living more like Amish people. And then on the other hand, you have sort of the, I call it like, there's also like, I call social Catholicism. This idea that in order to ensure that people are not being exploited by the system, the Catholic Church should ensure that there is a social safety net for people and things like this, and the Catholics have a responsibility to do that, right? So there's sort of three different strands of things that come out of Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum opening up this theological subdiscipline of social doctrine. It's, well, there's like the Austrians, like the Acton Institute with Father Robert Sirico. That's, Catholic priest founded this think tank that talks about like the morality of free markets. There's the Chesterton Belloc kind of people, and then there's like the social Catholicism kind of people as well. Yes?
If you were to say that the majority of Americans were in one of these groups, what group would it be?
Oh, I have no idea. I mean, there are Americans that would be in all sorts of these. So, I mean, what I can say is that, like, John Paul II said that that was an acceptable view. Pope Pius XI said that was an acceptable view. And Pope John the 23rd and Pope Paul VI had both said that this was an acceptable view. So, like, this is very unresolved in Catholic theology.
Do you feel the need to weigh in on this just because it was such a point of contention?
Yeah, well, it's kind of like this, right? In the 1800s, you've got the Industrial Revolution, right? You got the Industrial Revolution changing the previous social structure of wealth being based on land, and then people working land for themselves and their families, right, for subsistence. The Industrial Revolution is changing this. People are saying, okay, for the church's entire history, almost, wealth has been based on land. So, what is the church's response to this? Should Catholics be rejecting the Industrial Revolution? Should Catholics be supporting the Industrial Revolution? Should Catholics be working within the Industrial Revolution to make things better for everybody? What would be the most moral thing to do? After all, church, you have an infallible teaching authority on faith and morals. So, which is the most moral thing to do? So Leo has to address this. But Leo's document leads to these three different debates as to how Catholics should best address the Industrial Revolution, which is still unresolved today. So that's that. Modernism. Fourth issue here is modernism. So what is modernism? Modernism refers to sort of, how can I put it? It refers to like relativism. So starting in the 1800s, we sort of get, in academia, you start to get people that are trying to say that the truth about our discipline is that there isn't like an objective truth about it. Okay? Sort of like, almost all things are dependent upon culture. Right? There isn't like an objective truth that you can point to with regard to a given discipline. So, one of the big issues with modernism here is that the church now needs to address this. This is particularly big in schools. This starts out in universities, and then you have people who are educated at universities that want to teach in schools, especially Catholic schools. So you have, the Pascendi Dominici Gregis is Pope Pius X's condemnation of modernism. So modernism, by modernism he basically just means, like applying relativism to all different types of things. So he, of course, issues this document here, saying exactly what modernism is, and then condemning it.
That fell over like a lead balloon.
So, well, it worked for some time, because one of the effects of Pascendi Dominici Gregis was that in order to teach in a Catholic school, you had to be a neo-Thomist.
What?
You had to be a neo-Thomist teaching in a Catholic school.
Sorry, what is that?
You had to say that Thomas Aquinas was the kindest, warmest, bravest person ever to exist.
Oh.
Right, like one of the effects of Pascendi is that in order, what he basically says here is that the litmus test for knowing that you are not a modernist is how much you like Thomas Aquinas. Right? So one of the effects here is that starting in 1907, if you were at a Catholic university, you basically had to be a Thomist. You couldn't be an Augustinian, right? You couldn't be you couldn't be into Bonaventure, right? It was kind of like the litmus test for knowing that you were a good Catholic academic was your love of Thomas Aquinas. So like, this is going to be another thing that people are going to complain about at Vatican II. You know, like, why can't we study St. John Chrysostom? Why can't we study Augustine? And the answer is, well, if you get into those other guys, then you'll get into other guys, and you'll get into other guys, and eventually you'll be a heretic, right? So like at Catholic University of America, for example, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, to teach there, you had to like Thomas Aquinas. If you didn't, you would be fired. So Vatican II, of course, opens that restriction for better or for worse. Right? You know, like Georgetown University, you were not able to teach at Georgetown if you were not a neo-Thomist. Yes?
So of course, like, I went to Georgetown. And we were indoctrinated with metaphysics, and that was St. Thomas Aquinas stuff, right?
Oh yeah,
all of that.
Well, yeah. Metaphysics. That's Thomas Aquinas, going back
the logic,
to Aristotle.
the proofs, and all that.
Yeah. So yeah, if you learned that at Georgetown, that's what Georgetown was supposed to be teaching.
I only had 18 credits of it.
Okay.
But they did their job.
Right. Let's see. Also, ecumenism, I think I talked about this when I talked about the Mortalia Animos, right? Because people were fearing modernism, you didn't want to promote ecumenism, you did not want to promote going to talk to other religions because you're more likely to be scandalized and, converted yourself. So, until such time as we feel Catholics are ready to engage with that, with those people, we do not want you talking to people that are from other religions or philosophical persuasions or things like that. Let's see. Yeah, World War II, big issue in the church here. Which is worse, fascism or communism? So from the church's perspective here, these are both different forms of socialism that was condemned by Pope Leo XIII. So from the church's perspective, both of these are utterly terrible and have been condemned. But in the Europe of prior to World War II, it's like, okay, who is less likely to kill off the church here? Communists or fascists when they actually have political power? So there was sort of this debate as to which is the lesser of two evils, for practical politics, if we have to choose between a Germany ruled over by fascists and a Germany ruled over by communists, which one should the church be more inclined to live with? So, in the case of someone like Pius XII, said, without a doubt, the communists are worse. They're both terrible, they're both bad. Pius XII, whereas FDR would say, look, Stalin is not as bad as Hitler, they're both terrible, but we'd rather use Stalin to beat Hitler, right? From Pius XII's perspective, Stalin was worse. Right. So Pius XII would say, look, yeah, okay, the Nazis are racist, but you know what? They will not be able to. They'll not be able to sustain that racism for long, and they're eventually going to collapse on their own, right? Whereas the communists show no signs. There's communists trying to expand, and there's no sign that they'll be able. There's no sign of them, slowing down anytime soon. Whereas sort of Pius XII sort of saw Nazism as inevitably doomed for collapse, whereas he saw communism as not necessarily inevitably doomed for collapse. Right? So that was sort of Pius XII's way of thinking about it is, well, fascists like Mussolini, they want to they want to keep the church alive so they can use it, and they're eventually going to collapse anyway. The communists want to obliterate religion from the face of the earth, and we don't believe that they are necessarily doomed to collapse inevitably. Right? So there was that was where Pius XII was. That's why he's supporting Franco and people like that in the Spanish Civil War. On the other hand, you have other people within, say, the Vatican, like Pope John XXIII, the guy who eventually becomes Pope John XXIII, who says, well, actually, no, the communists are a lesser evil because, the communists at least claim to care about workers' rights, the Nazis are genocidal, the communists are not necessarily genocidal, they're equal opportunity killers. And communism is much more inevitably going to collapse than Nazism is. Right. So there's a sort of back and forth here. So then once fascism is defeated by World War II and you're dealing with the Cold War, there's then this approach to, okay, we've anathematized communism. You cannot be a Catholic and a communist. You are excommunicated if you are a Catholic and a practicing communist. So, should we take a hard-line approach to the communists? Should we take a soft-line approach to the communists? In other words, should we be reminding everyone how evil the communists are every day and haranguing the communists and excommunicating the communists and trying to figure out who's a communist and excommunicating them and, aligning with the Western anti-communist governments to go stick to the communists? Pius XII. Or should we just sort of say, look, okay, the communists control lots of people, it's bad, we get it, but if we're haranguing them and telling them they're evil and terrible every day, they're much more likely to make conditions worse for the Catholic countries they've conquered. So why don't we sort of ease up on the rhetoric? We'll try to work with those communist governments to maybe relax certain things, to make the lives of Catholics living behind the Iron Curtain a little bit better. Right? So, Pius XII, Paul VI. Right. So, for example,
How was John?
What?
And how was John?
John was a little bit more on the soft line side. Don't get me wrong, none of these popes thought communism was good. I don't want to leave you with that impression. But there is a debate as to what exactly the policy should be for how to confront something as evil as communism. Should we say, look, we hate your guts, but all right, come on. Stop, killing off Polish bishops. Right? What do you want us to do so that you won't kill off Polish bishops? No, we're not going to do that, but we might be willing to do this instead. Right? So one of the more comical examples here is that there was a Hungarian cardinal that was caught. He was caught in the Iron Curtain, right, at the last days of World War II. So what he did was, when the communists rolled in to Hungary, he walked into the American embassy and set up a radio station and denounced the communists every day. Right? And Pius XII was like, good, that's what he should have done. Let everyone know how evil the communists are in Hungary. So what happens is that, I think his name was Cardinal Vicente or something.
Wisniewski or something like that.
I remember that. So, what? Minzenti, that's it.
Yeah.
Minzenti, Cardinal Minzenti.
Yes.
So what happened was that Paul VI became Pope, and Minzenti is still there, essentially. So what happened was Paul VI said, look, American government, please get Minzenti out of your embassy in Hungary and bring him back to Italy. I'll give him something else to do. And Minzenti refused to go. It's like, no, I am not going. So Paul VI just relieved him of his official responsibilities and said, fine, your see is vacant, you have no credibility to talk anymore. So this, of course, made him, Cardinal Minzenti, very controversial, because there were certain people who were saying, this guy was in the American embassy denouncing the communists during the Cold War. Why wouldn't you want someone like that doing that? And how dare Paul VI shut down a cardinal for legitimately denouncing a communist oppressive government over a Catholic country? On the other hand, you've got people saying, well, Paul VI did that because he thought because the communists were threatening to make examples of Catholics if they didn't shut up Minzenti. So Paul VI said, okay, well, shut up Minzenti, leave the Catholics alone. They did, and they did. So these are sort of the 6 issues here between Vatican I and Vatican II. Any questions, things I can elaborate on? Got some time? Yeah.
I can tell you this, that we did a lot of studying on Thomas Aquinas with the Jesuits and the logic and the 7 proofs of God and everything. And the students, as students, we talked about this a lot, not just in the class, mostly out of class. Spent a lot of time on this stuff. And our consensus was that you really could, by the 60s, maybe they bought it earlier, by the 60s, you could neither prove nor disprove the existence of God, all these proofs of God and everything. So it was kind of rejected. It still came down I know personally it came down to you either believed or disbelieved. You really couldn't prove to someone that he should be Catholic or prove to someone that he should be a Christian. It came down to a matter of
Yeah,
faith.
that's that Karl Rahner stuff.
Yeah.
Jesuits. Yeah.
So,
So that's what I'm saying. So like Karl Rahner, one of the big Jesuit theologians in the 1960s, right? He was teaching that kind of stuff, and that was sort of Vatican II sort of like gave a blessing to teach Rahner. So lots of Catholic universities then opened up their profile beyond Thomas Aquinas. Now you could now study Augustine if you want. You could now be an Augustine scholar, but you could also be a Rahner scholar, and Rahner would sort of say things like that. You know, like you can't really prove the existence of God. It's more of a feeling that you have, or it's more of a personal experience rather than like a rational thing that you can prove. So let's see.
Excuse me,
Yes.
you said that the seminary system was very elitist. How did all these poor Irish boys go into the seminary?
Oh.
Who sponsored them? How did they get the money to go?
Yeah, well, let's say a couple of things. Number one, if you were in a religious order, religious orders didn't necessarily have the same thing. We're talking diocesan priesthood here, mostly. I mean, religious orders could still set their own regulations for who's going to become a priest. So many Irish religious orders, for example. Also, in the United States, they didn't have nearly the same problem they had in Europe. So in the United States, it's not like you had like almost all the Catholics that were in the United States were not exactly wealthy Catholics. So the American Catholic Church had to find other ways of funding this, of funding seminary education. So the American Catholic Church actually had like the most democratized priesthood, because you had so many Catholic immigrants coming in that depended upon the church for lots of things, and you know, a lot of them tithed, because the tithe. If you are an immigrant coming to the United States, and there's no welfare and no social security and no food stamps or anything like that, if you fall on hard times, where are you getting your poverty relief from? The church. So, the church made it very clear to all the immigrants coming in, your tithe to the church was your paying in for like what we now think of as welfare and social security. So the idea was that when immigrants came in, you would tithe to the church, and your tithe to the church would guarantee that if you fell on hard times, your local parish or your local commune or your local monastery would then essentially give back to you what you had been paying in, right? So they would often use tithe funds to fund seminary education for priests as well. Think about it, like this is very, like St. Mary's Riken, the Zerary brothers, like that school used to be free to attend. Why? Because the religious take vow of poverty, right? And as a result, you did not have you went there on a donation base. If you got accepted, the only thing you had to pay was a donation to the Zerary brothers. Right? So Catholic schools used to be free in this country, because when you had priests and religious teaching in the schools, there was no required tuition. It was seen as, if you paid your tithe to your church, you were able to go to the Catholic school. Because your local parishes, if those religious brothers just fell on hard times, they would just go and take money out of the tithe and give it to them, in the event their donations were not large enough. So same thing with seminary education was for Catholic schools in the around 1800s, 1900s, early 1900s. Let's see.
Was there any other concern during the rise of the Industrial Revolution, that if people put value on capitalism and wealth, that they wouldn't tithe, that if all of a sudden their identity was how much money they made in the Industrial Revolution, then they would no longer be willing to give and tithe to the church as much, because they would be focused on their own internal wealth?
Yeah, well, I guess that's something that Leo XIII kind of touches on in Rerum Novarum, because I mean, one of the things he does say is, he says, look, no matter what age you're living in, there are people who are materialistic, but you know, the system in which you live, the system and the culture in which you live also has a big effect on the way you think. So, you know, he says one of the big downsides, he says, to like capitalism and socialism is that they both overvalue the economic aspect of man rather than valuing the spiritual aspect of man the same amount they should. So he does say that if you're living in a consumeristic culture, then that sort of degrades your humanity a little bit, right? So he doesn't express it in those terms. What he does say is that if you're living in a consumeristic culture, which you can have a consumeristic culture without being a capitalist system, but capitalism can sort of promote a consumerist culture, and that's something that if you live in a capitalist system you need to watch out for. Is, if you're in a consumerist system, then you're much more then you might be more likely, depending on other things in your culture, to do that, to like think that way or not think that way. The way John Paul II phrases this, John Paul II in Sedesimus Annus, what he points out is that in a market system, markets, is that like free markets, what you spend your money on is a reflection of your values. So what he says is that, so what John Paul II says is that like, if I value like justice and charity, then you would expect the people operating in a free market to spend their money on certain things that they think promote justice and charity. But if you live in a free market system where people value like, instant gratification and consumeristic goods, then you'd expect the people to be spending their money on instant gratification. In which case, one of them is like a good, one of them is like good, and one of them is bad. But he wouldn't say that it's necessarily bad, he would say that it can be bad, but like the other things in your society help determine whether or not you're going to be that person or this person.
It's all choices.
I can say one of the best examples I was exposed to was Shoals Cafeteria in D.C., where he paid his people well. It was a capitalistic thing, he owned it and so forth. He paid his people well, they stayed there forever, working there, bussing tables for 30 years or whatever. And I think at the end he had given everything away, and he provided just an honest meal at a worker's price. So it really fit a lot of these little guidelines of whatever, but he was exceptional.
All right, at this point, class is over. If you have any other questions, you can feel free to stay back. Have a good week.